Before the first pharaoh ever drew breath, before the pyramids cast their long shadows across the desert sand, there was a god who waited. He stood at the place where the living world ended, and something else, something vast and unknowable, began. His form was that of a man crowned with the head of a jackal, black as the fertile Nile silt, black as the absence of all things. His name was Anubis. And in the oldest strata of Egyptian belief, before Osiris claimed dominion over death, it was this solitary guardian who held the scales of eternity. He did not frighten. He simply endured, patient, watchful, eternal. The Egyptians did not choose the jackal for Anubis without reason. Jackals were creatures of the desert margins. They haunted the edges of cemeteries, drawn by the scent of the dead. To the ancient Egyptian mind, this was not merely scavenging. It was guardianship. The jackal presided over the threshold between worlds. Early texts call Anubis by names that predate his familiar form, Kenti Ementiu, meaning foremost of the Westerners, a title designating him as king of all the dead, who lay in the west where the sun descended each night. He was worshipped at Abydos before Osiris ever was. His origins sink into the oldest mud of Egyptian civilization, deeper than memory, deeper than record. The mythology surrounding Anubis's birth is itself wrapped in shadow. In some traditions, he was the son of Ra, the sun god. In others, born of Nephthys, goddess of night and morning, and the dark god Set, though raised in secret by Isis to protect him from his father's wrath. This ambiguity is deliberate. A god who stands between light and darkness should not belong entirely to either. Anubis bore the tension of contradictions, born of betrayal, yet devoted to truth, associated with death, yet wholly committed to the preservation of life beyond death. He was not a god of endings. He was a god of transitions. And that distinction, the Egyptians understood, made all the difference. The moment that defined Anubis for all eternity came with the murder of Osiris. Set, consumed by jealousy, slew his brother and scattered his body across the land of Egypt. When Isis gathered the pieces and Anubis received the shattered god, something unprecedented occurred. Anubis cleaned the wounds. He wrapped the body in linen soaked with sacred resins. He pressed natron salts against the flesh to halt decay. He spoke incantations over each bandaged limb. According to Egyptian belief, Anubis invented mummification in that single act of devotion, transforming a broken body into something that could endure the journey ahead. Every priest who ever bent over a funerary table performed, in some measure, the work of Anubis. Once the mummification rites were complete, Anubis did not withdraw. He remained always. Egyptian funerary art places him at the entrance of tombs, at the head of the sarcophagus, crouched atop the canopic shrine like a sentinel that never sleeps. The famous gilded Anubis shrine discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb, that magnificent black jackal resting on a gilded chest, was not merely decorative. It was functional. It was the god himself, standing watch. Tomb robbers in the ancient world understood this well. To violate a tomb was to transgress against Anubis directly. The Egyptians posted no guards they trusted more completely than the darkness behind those painted eyes and the divine authority they represented. When an Egyptian drew their final breath, the journey did not end. It began. The soul, called the Ba, rose from the body as a human-headed bird, hovering uncertainly at the threshold of the physical world. It was here, in the first moments of death, that Anubis appeared, not as a figure of terror, but as a guide. He reached out, or so the texts suggest, and took the soul by the hand, leading it toward the entrance of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. This act of guidance was considered an act of profound mercy. The dead were never simply abandoned at the threshold. They were escorted by the most faithful escort in all creation, across the boundary that no living thing could cross alone. The Duat was not a comfortable place. Egyptian texts describe it as a landscape of terrifying beauty, rivers of fire, gates guarded by serpents with blades for tongues, darkness so complete it had physical weight. The soul had to navigate this realm armed with knowledge, spells drawn from the Book of the Dead, words of power inscribed on papyrus scrolls buried alongside the body. But knowledge alone was insufficient. Anubis walked ahead, his black figure cutting through the darkness like a compass needle pointing true north. He knew the names of every gate, every guardian, every threshold. He had walked this path since before the first human death, and he would walk it after the last. In his company, the soul could proceed. After passage through the perils of the Duat, the soul arrived at a chamber unlike any other, the Hall of Two Truths, called Mat in the Egyptian tongue. It was vast beyond imagining. 42 divine judges sat in rows along its walls, each representing a different province of Egypt, each awaiting the soul's declaration. The ceiling was painted with all the stars of heaven. The air carried the scent of cedar and something older, something that had no name. At the center of this enormous hall stood a set of golden scales, and beside those scales, in absolute silence, stood Anubis. He wore no expression that could be read by mortal comprehension. He simply waited, as he had always waited, for what must now unfold. Before the weighing could begin, the soul was required to speak. Before each of the 42 divine judges, the deceased declared their innocence of a specific transgression. These were the negative confessions, a litany of sins denied, a declaration of the self shaped by a lifetime of choices. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not spoken lies. I have not caused suffering to the hungry. I have not withheld water from the thirsty. 42 declarations, each directed at a different judge with a different divine name. The Egyptians understood something profound. The journey through death was not passive. The soul arrived as a participant, not a spectator. They had spent their entire lives preparing the words they would need to speak in this room. When the confessions were complete, Anubis moved to the scales. With his dark hands, he removed from one pan a single object, an ostrich feather, white as starlight, impossibly light, impossibly significant. This was the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order made physical. It weighed nothing, and it weighed everything. Ma'at was the foundation upon which Egyptian civilization believed all existence rested. The proper order of things, the harmony between gods and humans, the alignment of action with truth. A life lived in accordance with Ma'at left no mark upon the soul. Against this feather, against truth itself, the heart of the deceased would now be placed. The whole of a human life compressed into a single organ, about to be measured, the heart. The ancient Egyptians believed the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence, memory, conscience, and identity. When they mummified a body, they left the heart carefully within the chest cavity, preserved with the utmost care, for it would be needed again. Now, in the Hall of Two Truths, Anubis reached into the soul of the deceased and drew forth the heart, a glowing, dense, weighty thing, heavy with the accumulated record of every action, every thought, every choice made in the course of a human life. He placed it gently into the opposite pan of the scale. Then he stepped back and released the balance. The entire universe held its breath. What tipped those scales determined everything that came after. Beside the scales crouched a creature that belonged to no clean category. Part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. Ammit was constructed entirely from the most dangerous animals known to the Egyptian world. She was called the devourer of hearts, the bone eater, the great of death. She waited beside the scale with a patience that bordered on hunger. If the heart proved heavier than the feather, if a life had been lived in cruelty, deception, violence, greed, Anubis would retrieve the heart from the scale and feed it to Ammit. And then came the second death, not merely the death of the body, but the annihilation of the soul itself. No afterlife, no continuation, just absolute cessation. The Egyptians called it the death that never ends. Anubis watched the scales. His function was not interpretation, not advocacy, not mercy in the human sense. He read the scales as one reads a fact. If the feather rose and the heart descended, the life had been lived in sin, and the soul was forfeit. If the heart and feather balanced, if they held perfectly level, that too was rare, and spoke of a life lived in conscious alignment with Ma'at. But the most hopeful outcome was the heart rising, becoming lighter than the feather. A life of genuine goodness, of compassion extended to others, of truth spoken when lies would have been safer. Such a heart had actually shed its weight. Anubis declared the verdict without pleasure, without cruelty, without hesitation. Then the next stage of the journey could begin. Beside the scale throughout all proceedings stood another divine witness, Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, holding a palette and stylus. He recorded everything. Every confession, every declaration, every movement of the scale. His records were absolute and could not be falsified, not because forgery was impossible, but because Thoth perceived truth in dimensions that deception could not reach. The Book of the Dead spells that the deceased carried were intended, in part, to prepare the soul for Thoth's questions. He would ask the names of the gates. He would ask the names of the gods. Knowledge was itself a key. The verdict of Anubis and the record of Thoth together constituted the complete testimony of a soul. And that testimony was final. For those whose hearts were found worthy, Anubis himself escorted the soul onward, through the final gate into the presence of Osiris upon his throne, and eventually to the field of reeds, known as Aru. This was the Egyptian paradise, an idealized reflection of the Nile Valley at its most abundant. Green marshlands, clear water, wheat growing taller than memory. The soul would dwell there in a version of the life they had loved, reunited with those they had lost, free from suffering and the indignities of aging and illness. It was not a place of passive rest. In Aru, the soul continued to work, to create, to exist, but in conditions of perfect harmony. Anubis had delivered them there. His part was complete, his promise fulfilled. The cult of Anubis extended far beyond mythology into the physical practices of Egyptian civilization. The chief embalmer in any funerary temple wore the mask of Anubis during mummification rites, a black jackal mask that transformed the priest into a living incarnation of the god. This was not theater, it was theology. When the priest's hands wrapped linen and applied sacred oils, they were understood to be the hands of Anubis himself, working through a human vessel. The city of Sinopolis, city of dogs, was dedicated entirely to his worship. Sacred jackals were kept there, fed and honored in his name. When they died, they were mummified with the same ceremony afforded human priests. In the geography of Egyptian religion, Anubis occupied every space where life and death met. Mummification required the removal and separate preservation of the organs, each one placed in its own sealed vessel called a canopic jar. 4 jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus, each jar protecting a specific organ: the liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines. But overseeing the entire process, sanctifying the act of preservation, was Anubis. He was present in the spells inscribed on each jar's lid. He was invoked with each organ's removal. The Egyptians did not view organ extraction as desecration. It was preparation, with Anubis ensuring that every piece of the physical self was preserved so that the resurrected body could be made whole in the afterlife. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was abandoned. Every part of the person mattered. As Egyptian civilization evolved across millennia, Anubis did not disappear, but his role shifted. Osiris rose to prominence as the supreme lord of the dead, absorbing many of the functions that Anubis had once held alone. Anubis became his subordinate, a divine lieutenant rather than a supreme ruler. Scholars debate whether this represents a theological evolution or the absorption of one cultural tradition by another as Egypt's various regional cults merged. What is certain is that Anubis accepted this subordination without conflict, at least within the mythology. Perhaps because the role he retained, guardian, embalmer, psychopomp, weigher of souls, was already so fundamental that no reassignment of titles could diminish it. He remained the one god every Egyptian was absolutely certain they would meet. Thousands of years have passed since the last priest of Anubis spoke his name in ritual. Empires have risen and collapsed into dust. The jackals still patrol the edges of the desert at nightfall. They did not receive the message that their god had been retired. But Anubis himself has proven equally resistant to obsolescence. His image, that composed jackal head on a human body, scales in hand, has become one of the most recognized symbols of ancient Egypt in the world. In museums from Cairo to London to New York, his statues are met with something beyond mere historical curiosity. People stop. They look longer than they planned to. There is something in that carved face, patient and knowing, that speaks to something very old inside the living. We have always known that we are mortal. He has always been waiting. What does it mean that humanity has always needed a god like Anubis? Not a god of creation or fertility or war. Those are gods of the living. Anubis belongs to the threshold, to the moment when certainty ends and the unknown begins. Every civilization in human history has fashioned some version of this figure: the guide, the weigher, the solemn escort from one form of existence to another. The Egyptians gave him the most complete form: a jackal head and patient hands, scales of pure truth and a heart that could not be bribed. He made a promise at the beginning of time that no soul would make the crossing alone and that the crossing would be fair. After 5,000 years, that promise still resonates. That is what gods are for. That is why, before all others, there was Anubis.